Okay, now we can get started. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in, be it on the Zoom call or on our Facebook. I am joined today by Bob Stock of the US Census Bureau, and we're going to be talking about the state of the Vermont census and ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has produced challenges for participation rates. But before I introduce Bob, I will just say I'm Maeve Power. I'm an organizer with VPIRG, working mainly on our COVID-19 response and resources. This webinar series is part of that work. We're trying to really cover as many topics as we can and try to discover the various ways that this pandemic is affecting Vermonters and our systems and the issues that we work on. We've never particularly worked on the census in specifically, but we've worked on a lot of governance and democracy work throughout our nearly 50-year history. So the census in many ways touches almost all of our issues, and the impacts that it has on Vermont and the resources that were provided by the federal government are very widespread. So without further ado, I will introduce Bob. He's, like I said, with the US Census Bureau. He's a partnership specialist for Vermont. And with that, I'll give the floor to you to give a little bit more background on yourself.
Thanks, Maeve. Yeah, I've been with the United States Census Bureau now for about 2 years. My background's actually in the private sector in technology, specifically cybersecurity. So the decennial census, just as background, although I have a feeling you got a pretty informed audience here, but it is mandated by Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution that we conduct a census of all residents of the United States every 10 years, years ending in 0. And we've been doing this since 1790. The census is one of a number of things that the Census Bureau does. We're the leading statistical agency in the United States, providing data about the people of the United States and its economy, used by all kinds of different entities, government, private citizens. So when we're not doing this, we have about 130 other surveys that we do, one of which I'll mention in a little bit more depth later, the American Community Survey, which some of you that are on may remember the long form of the census. That is now the American Community Survey, and I'll talk a little bit later about why that's important. The census itself is important essentially for 3 different reasons. One, which we don't have to worry too much about, is it determines congressional representation. Well, the threshold for representation is a population of 750,000. When I moved to Vermont on January 1st, 1984, the population was about 602,000. It's about 623,000 now. So we're not probably going to get to 750,000 anytime soon. Although I was thinking about it this morning when I was out running, is that with some of the flight from the cities because of COVID-19, who knows? As people become more and more, and companies and employers become more and more comfortable with distance, with people working from home, they can work in Vermont just as easily as downtown Manhattan. So we'll see what happens with that. But it's also primarily for Vermont, 2 other reasons. One, it determines the funding for about 55 major programs that have significant impact on Vermonters, particularly the most vulnerable amongst us. Some of those programs, Medicaid, SNAP, which is food stamps, Section 8 housing, Medicare Part B assistance, infrastructure, first responder assistance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we get one chance every 10 years to get it right. Although it is not a Census Bureau sanctioned study, there was one done by the, some of you may have heard about it, the George Washington Institute for Public Policy back in 2015, where they felt that Vermont got about $4,000 per person per year based on the 2010 census. So we get about 2.5 billion from the federal government every year. So I would say that those numbers are reasonably accurate, which is why it's so important. We count everybody, count them only once, hopefully, and count them in the right place. So The second reason that this is very important for the residents of Vermont is that it also determines our own apportionment in terms of our senators from Montpelier, senators in Montpelier, and our reps in Montpelier. I've had some discussions with various legislators around the state, and give you an example, the Northeast Kingdom legislators from Essex, from Caledonia, and Orleans County are very concerned about losing population. Chittenden County, not so much, because we're gaining population. So it's, again, it becomes very important from the standpoint of apportionment. Three things that I will add about this. The census is different. Kind of surprised me, actually. I would have thought with the internet being around as long as it has, that we would be able to respond via internet back in 2010 or maybe even 2000, but that was not the case. So this is the first census where people can respond via internet. They can also respond via telephone or traditional paper, or we wind up sending an enumerator, because remember, our requirement is to count everyone. So it is easy. That's the takeaway from that, is because you have a number of different ways of doing it. Plus, there are only 9 questions on it. So and we do not, and it's safe, because we are not interested in very much personal identifiable information. Since we don't want social security numbers, we don't want credit cards, we don't want bank information. Basically, it's name, telephone number, address, and the only reason we want the phone number is in case we have to call to get some clarification. And then some demographics. But when we do receive it, the PII, personal identifiable information, it's stored offline, and we do not share with anybody. No other government agency. We don't share with the FBI, the CIA, ICE, Homeland Security, and we are not superseded by the Patriot Act, and that has been tested in court. We operate under Title 13 of the US Code. Every Census Bureau employee takes an oath to safeguard personal identifiable information for life. The penalties are severe for violating that. 5 years in prison, $250,000 fine. So we take this very, very seriously. So it's important, it's safe, and it's easy. As far as where things stand in Vermont, we are at about, when I looked at it, I haven't had a chance to look at it for the numbers from today, but when I looked at it this morning, 50.9% self-response rate against a 65% self-response rate at the end of the 2010. Now, I'm confident that we're going to do quite well on this for a number of different reasons. One, we've extended, because of COVID, the self-response date from July 31st to October 31st. That's an additional 3 months to be able to respond. So once we're able to get back out there again, I'm talking about the partnership specialist, working with partners, there's many ways that we can effort this to make sure that we get some more self-response. And I'll talk about a couple of innovative things we're doing now as well. So that's one reason. The other reason is that one of the things that we have are what are known as complete count committees. And these are set up usually under the auspices of city government, town government, but not always. Give you an example, Burlington has one called BTV Counts, Essex Junction has one, Winooski has one, South Burlington has one, St. Albans has one, and there's a number of others scattered around the state. And these are citizens that they're made up of folks from government, private sector, public sector, nonprofits, could be faith-based, and they help get the word out, and they help reach the hard-to-count communities, which we can talk about as we go on. So they're working really hard. And in those areas where we have complete count committees, we're doing quite well. Additionally, Governor Scott in November established a Vermont State Complete Count Commission. Now, this is chaired by Jason Broughton, who is the Vermont State Librarian, who I work very closely with. And it's made up of the heads of all of the departments within state government, in addition to outside folks from LGBTQ, the Howard Center, a number of global foundries, a number of other large companies in Vermont, and a number of other large private nonprofits. So AARP, for example, the University of Vermont. And so we have it pretty well covered that way. They've been very active. And so, again, I think we're doing excuse me, doing quite well in those areas. So we'll be able to step those efforts up a little bit. Let's talk about, just for a second, where we're having some problems. Vermont has about 330,000 households, as the Census Bureau defines them. You may think of them as residents, and that's another way of thinking about it. About 270,000 of those are occupied. To date, we have responses from about 180,000 of them. So we've got a ways to go. Now, what about those ones that aren't occupied? Do we count them? Yes, we do. And what about the ones that we haven't counted? We're going to count them. Yes, we will. We will count all 330,000 of them one way or another. So one of the programs that we were in the process of doing, which we just started about 2 weeks ago, is known as Update Leave. It's kind of an odd name for something, but what it means is that in those areas where we know that a high percentage of people either do not have internet access, use a post office box, because the Bureau is residence-based, address-based. So what we do is, many of you will remember the old days when you'd get a phone book, somebody would hang it on the door. But what we do is we go and we hang the invitation to respond along with the directions on how to do so on 61,000 different households in Vermont. That's about 17.6% of the total households in Vermont. So that gives you a pretty good sense of just how rural we are, and just what the issues are around broadband, around cell service, things like that, which is the reason why we're doing this. And a lot of our post offices in the rural areas are non-delivery post offices. They might be a combination of, post office boxes where you can go pick up your mail, buy stamps, mail things, probably get dry cleaning, Vermont State Liquor, and shop. So those we're well aware of also. And if you look at a map on the 2020 Census Response Indicator, you'll see some dark areas along the spine of the Green Mountains and up in Grand Isle, especially Aalborg, and up in the Northeast Kingdom. That's where the Update Leave program is concentrating, that and where we know there's student housing. So with that, the other thing that was something that we just started, we did about 2 weeks ago, as I mentioned, with the approval of the governor. And we are observing all of the rules and regulations, both city, town, state, and federal. We do not have any social contact, any contact with any of the residents. We are masked, loved, and we just leave it and we move on. So you may see them out there, just know that it is approved for them to be there. So we're eagerly await. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so in the past, has there been more connection with people at the door in a canvassing operation or some sort? And now it's kind of just, we're still doing it, but we're just leaving the papers there and hoping that the residents get them.
It's a good question. You're right. The Update Leave program is one of our outside outreach. The main one that most people think about when they used to see the census taker walking around with a clipboard, although these days it's an iPad with 59 different languages on it. But that is not scheduled to start at the moment until July 15th. Okay. So, and that's a malleable date. We have some other things that we have not scheduled yet. The homeless count, for example, which is typically done on 2 nights and 3 days. We know we're going to do it, but we haven't scheduled it yet. And there's a couple of other programs, what we call group quarters. Some of it we're doing now, some of it we'll do later. So I believe, you asked me a question about students. If you were in a dorm on April 1st, well, actually whether you were or you weren't, as long as you weren't living off campus, if you were registered on campus on April 1st, you are counted. That's done by the school, and that is something that we do with the schools. We give them a couple of different ways that they can enumerate. Most of them choose electronic. And essentially, it's just going to the registrar's office and filling it in and sending it in. What is more of a challenge are the off-campus students, especially this time around, because we had just started the Update Leave when we were shut down. And so a lot of them have left. Will we get the seniors that graduated? If they're out of state, not for Vermont, most likely. but they'll be picked up wherever they are. But we will get the ones that are coming back, and the ones that stayed. We'll eventually get them all.
Yeah, I was saying to Bob, for our viewers before we started this, that, you know, as a young person, I've never done the census before. And so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. I thought it might take me a really long time.
Right.
And I really wasn't. I think for people maybe even younger than me and students living off of campus, like you were talking about, it just seems like a foreign thing. Like
Right.
is my parents counting me in theirs? And at what point do I have to do it myself? And I think that is a question that a lot of people, especially in the Burlington area, might have. So I just wonder, you know, how do you try to address that?
We work very closely with schools. So for me, for example, my responsibilities, in addition to some other ones, Chittenden County and Grand Isle County and Franklin County. So I work very closely with Champlain College, St. Michael's, and UVM, for example, in terms of making sure that they are communicating, which I'm making that sound like I have to hold their arm up and back of them. No, they want them counted. They get it. So they're constantly in correspondence with their off-campus students. There's been a number of different brochures I've seen that they've used. Middlebury had one that was quite creative, which gives them directions on how to do it and explains why they should be counted here as opposed to where their parents are. Mm-hmm. So, and then those that we miss, we will probably pick up during the physical enumeration period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an interesting thing just thinking about it in terms of especially Burlington's population. If all those students are counted, you can imagine that there is a pretty accurate understanding of how many people are in this city over the course of the next decade, assuming that colleges aren't accepting tons more, tons less than they were at the previous census. But I think it is interesting, we were talking earlier about the difficulties with rural populations and a lot of people having PO boxes in Vermont. And so is that an issue that is happening nationally, or is it unique to Vermont in a lot of ways? And how are we facing it as a country?
You would find that if you looked on a map of the United States that we provide on the 2020census.gov website, in terms of response, you would find the states that are the most rural are the ones that are having the lowest counts, if you will. Vermont's about 45th out of 50, although we're closing in on Montana. But we passed Wyoming a couple of weeks ago. So when we restarted the Update Leave program, although I live and work out of my home here in Shelburne, I work for the New York Regional Census Center. And they manage all of New England plus New York, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. Maine and Vermont are the only two states where we have restarted the Update Leave, and that's just for that very reason that you brought up, because of how rural we are. We have to be able to reach these people. We have to be able to give them an opportunity to respond, and we understand the difficulties around that. So, and because of the requirement to count everybody, we are physical address based. We have to be. We'd have no way of knowing whether we had people correct or not if we just blitzed post office boxes. So we don't. So we make sure that we go to every census geographers are the best in the world. We know where things are, and so we know how to get there.
Yeah. And another question I just have in terms of Vermont specifically, when we get resources as a state based on our population as collected from the census, are those resources then distributed based on population within Vermont as well?
I don't know. I think that is more of a question for the executive and the legislative branch as to how that is distributed. All I know is that the funding is based on the head count. Yes,
well, that makes sense. So I guess just moving on, what do you think is kind of the silver lining of this situation? Do you think it's made the Census Bureau a bit more, ready to address challenges going forward? Or has it just been a difficult thing and you're just trying to keep up with it all?
No, I mean, I think all of us that are in outreach would prefer to be out working with partners. There is, just as an aside, there's a program that I'm itching to restart. It's called Mobile Questionnaire Assistance. And what we would do with this, working with our complete count committees, I'll give you an example in Barrie, would work with Capstone, who provides a food shelf. So if we were able to be out, we would be able to put Title 13 people like well, not myself, but census operations people there that could actually assist people in completing the census. So that's a program that I'm very anxious for us to restart. We could do that in front of a Walmart. We could, any place that a partner is willing to cooperate with us, we can do that. Could do it at a McDonald's. And we have the personnel and we're ready and willing and able to do it. It's just a question of being able to physically be back out there again. So, yeah, but in terms of, I think the silver lining, which is where you began this, is that extending the self-response rate from July 31st to October 31st, that gives us a very, very long window to get this done, to really be able to get to everybody.
Yeah.
And at this point now, where we're getting a great response, for example, in Chittenden County, Franklin County, Addison, we're able to focus our efforts more now on the ones who are having a problem. Windham County, Essex, Grand Isle. I mean, you mentioned Essex earlier. I mean, not only is it the least populated county in Vermont, it's the least populated county in New England. I think it's like 9 people per square mile. And there's really no central point there other than a grammar school. So, but we'll figure it out. We'll get there. We'll get them. We'll get everybody.
Well, we have a question in the chat that I'd like to ask you. So they said, should people residing in long-term motel housing with mail sorted by the property management be receiving census info packets and or visits in the same way that a residential home would? And they said that they're concerned about these groups that are in great need and won't be counted. Perhaps might be enough.
So let me answer. Yeah, that's a great question, by the way. And it's one that I asked myself about 6 months ago, and I got a pretty good answer for it. If it is a registered, let's say, group home, maybe with the state, like we have one here in Shelburne. In that case, we would cover them under their group quarters that I mentioned earlier, where we would work directly with the administrator for the group home to enumerate. If it is more of a privately run motel, for example, that's been converted into more long-term, I see some of that on Route 7. In those particular cases, it would depend on whether they're using that as an address or not. But one of the things they could count on is getting a visit one way or another. Either they would, if they are using it as an address and they do complete the census, they wouldn't hear from us again. If they did not, then they would hear from us. So it really depends on whether it's public or private and how is it set up. In some cases, they're halfway houses, but they may be quasi nonprofit, sort of arm's length from the state. Those kind of fall into a gray area where in most cases we would probably approach them on the group quarters. But if that didn't work, we would then send enumerators. We will cover every geographical address in Vermont, one way or another. We're not going to miss them.
Yeah. So it is, it's great that there is this extension happening. And it almost kind of seems like maybe there might be an even more accurate counting than there has been in past years because of that. But for those people who inevitably will not be counted, how does the Census Bureau account for them?
We don't, because the Constitution states that we will do a physical count. So if we miss them, we miss them. From the standpoint of determining representation and determining funding, it has to be an accurate count. Mm-hmm. We have the hard to count populations. We have the homeless, we have the undocumented, we have the 18 to 24 that are not living at home. We have, some others, but we have different ways of addressing all of these to make sure that we get to people. Migrant justice, for example, is one. The Refugee Resettlement Committee people, that's another one. We work very closely with all of these folks to make sure that we do count everybody. And I think, you know, the important thing, typically for people that are not responding in some of the hard to counts, it's because they don't think it's safe to respond, but it is. We're not going to share that information with anybody, period.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things you hear about the census is don't be afraid to take it.
Right.
If you are an undocumented person or somebody that you worry that you could be in danger if that information got out. And of course, like you said, it will not.
Nope.
Yeah.
We will not. And by the way, I mean, we're not asking a citizenship question, right? I mean, it's a residential question. I mean, where do you live? What's your name? Right? How old are you? Things like that, right? But yeah.
Could you just touch a little bit more on, because I had never heard of this before, you mentioned it, but the community survey responses that are a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, I forgot about that. I did mention that earlier. Some of you that are on may remember the long form of the census. That was done away with back in the year 2000, 2 censuses ago. So it is now part of what's known as the American Community Survey. And that is a statistical sampling done every year in every census tract in the United States. And it's reported as a 5-year moving average. There is a tool on the census.gov website known as Response Outreach Area Mapper. But because we're the feds, we like acronyms, so it's ROAM, R-O-A-M. And you can go in on this tool on census.gov, and you can zero in on the census tract where you live, and there will be a lot of information. What I use it for is that it gives me a predicted non-response for any given census tract in Vermont to the 2020 census. So that's some of the tools that we've been using when we were setting up the complete count committees that I mentioned earlier. So we have a pretty good sense of where we need to be in terms of working with partners, and we do. And we have, within Vermont, we have well over 600 partners. There are 4 other partnership specialists like me scattered around the state working with these partners on a daily basis. And as I mentioned, about 22 complete count committees and the state complete count commission. So it's taken very seriously.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like it, and I hope that doing this webinar will maybe increase some participation for anybody watching. I can attest that it took me about 5 to 10 minutes to not only do myself, but my roommates as well. So it's a really important thing. Do you have anything that you'd like to leave our viewers with before we sign out?
Just the 3 things that I mentioned, that it's important, it's safe, and it's easy. And you know, it's just so important for the next 10 years that we get this right. And we're working very hard to make sure that we do, along with our partners.
Yes. All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us and enlightening us around it. And hopefully we see those numbers jump up over the next course of the 3 months. But get your neighbors involved. Tell everybody that you know to do the census. And
and folks can follow Vermont numbers on 2020census.gov response. If they just Google that, it'll bring it up, and you can drill all the way down to your town to see how it's doing.
That sounds wonderful.
All right.
Well, really, I'll start safely canvassing my neighbors one of these days.
Thanks again, Maeve.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Bob. And thanks. See you soon.
Right. Bye.
Bye.